The small yard outside Sarah Lynch's house was filled with a festive atmosphere. She had decided to organize a modest celebration for a few close friends and family to mark the end of her daughter Julia's semester. The party seemed simple and relaxed: light music, snacks on the tables, and lamps flickering softly under the evening sky. Sarah didn't usually like noisy gatherings, but this time she gave in to Julia's request to make it something special. Sarah smiled, greeted the guests, and politely engaged in conversation, but she kept finding herself mentally reviewing today's worries and plans for the next day. Her attention was diverted only by a new guest who appeared to accompany Julia. Sarah looked at the stranger and noticed a young man in his 20s. His name was Liam. Julia looked excited as she introduced him to her mother and seemed to have high hopes for this meeting. Liam was wearing a light-colored shirt that hung loosely on him, with the sleeves down and a bracelet on his wrist. His dark, slightly unkempt hair fell over his eyes, and he brushed it back with a careless hand as he cast an attentive glance in Sarah's direction. She felt his gaze from the first second, as if he were carefully scanning her appearance and behavior. There was something disturbing in that look. Too much scrutiny. For a moment, Sarah felt a weakness she hadn't felt in a long time and tried to convince herself that it was just imagination. "Good evening, Mrs. Lynch," Liam said, extending his hand to shake. His voice was low and calm, but with a touch of confidence that was atypical for his age. Sarah took his hand a little hesitantly, feeling the brief touch, quite firm and a little lingering, she thought. Her heart sped up for a moment as she realized she had been looking at his face for too long. She was embarrassed and immediately returned his hand, smiling and nodding in response. "This is a wonderful evening. Julia has talked about you so much that I feel like I know you," Sarah said, trying to sound casual, but in reality, she felt uncomfortable. There was something about Liam that threw her off balance. A mysterious adolescent charm mixed with a rebellious streak that was evident in his eyes and the way he carried himself. "I've heard a lot about you too," Liam said, not looking away. "Julia said you were a great cook and had an amazing collection of antiques." Sarah smiled slightly. He seemed to be trying to impress her, and it was both pleasant and dangerous. She felt an uneasy, forbidden curiosity bloom in her heart. The last few years had been quite monotonous for her, and it had long seemed that life would not bring any new surprises. Trying to drown out her inner turmoil, Sarah turned to the other guests, trying to distract herself with conversation. But still, her eyes kept stumbling over Liam. He was in her field of vision when he was laughing with Julia or exchanging jokes with other guests. His movements, his gestures. Every little thing caught her attention. Something about him stirred up long-forgotten feelings, and the more she tried to avoid it, the more she felt he could see it. Soon Liam came up to her, holding a glass of wine. "May I join you?" he asked, pointing to an empty seat next to her. Sarah nodded, again trying to keep her face calm, although her breathing was a little faster. The conversation was small talk. They talked about music, traveling, and he even jokingly told her about his friends and the band he played in. "You're a really interesting person, Mrs. Lynch," he said with a slight tilt of his head, looking into her eyes. Sarah felt herself blushing and tried to avoid his gaze. Liam did not look away, and his attention was almost searing. She felt trapped, as if she were under a hypnosis from which she could not escape. She was embarrassed, and at the same time, this indescribable excitement was overwhelming. She mentally reproached herself for her weakness and for allowing herself to even think about the young man in this way. Suddenly, Julia appeared, her voice breaking the silence between them. "Mom, are you here?" Julia smiled broadly, but her eyes were full of curiosity and suspicion. Sarah quickly composed herself, held her gaze, and smiled at her daughter. Liam also stepped aside, looking at ease, but Sarah noticed that he gave her a brief glance that spoke volumes. Later, when the party was over and all the guests had left, Sarah was alone in her house. She tried to convince herself that it was all just imaginary excitement, but deep down she knew that something important had already begun to change. And although her mind told her to forget the meeting, her heart still held on to every look, every word, and every drop of the incomprehensible tension that evening had brought into her life. The town where Sarah Lynch lived with her daughter Julia was quiet and conservative. It was a typical American suburb where comfort and privacy were valued, but at the same time nothing could be hidden from prying eyes. Everyone knew almost everything about their neighbors, and discussions about someone's new relationship, purchases, or even repairs were always part of everyday life. This town had its own measured rhythm, and everyone's life seemed predictable, almost static. Sarah, however, felt like an outsider in this slow and cozy world. She used to live here with her husband, and together they built their lives, took care of Julia, and formed a stable future. But it all fell apart when one day she found out that her husband had long been interested in more than just her. At first, she was in denial. She tried to cope with the pain by convincing herself that it was a temporary crisis in their relationship. But he left, leaving her alone with dashed hopes and a sense of betrayal. It took Sarah a long time to come to terms with his betrayal, which exposed years of lies. Now she tried to live for Julia, who became her only support and comfort. Sarah never allowed herself to tell her daughter too much about her feelings or complain, but she knew that Julia felt her pain and supported her in her own way. Julia grew up faster than she should have, and there was something special about this quiet, reserved girl that made her more mature than many of her peers. Sarah and Julia tried to build their lives, but the emptiness left by her ex-husband was felt in everything. Sarah avoided new acquaintances and did not want to rush into a new relationship. She became more withdrawn, lost some of her former self-confidence, and even her friends' attempts to support her seemed futile. She thought that her romantic life was over, that she was now just a mother, that her only purpose was to provide peace and stability for Julia. But Liam was different. He attracted the attention of everyone, especially girls, with his appearance and unusual style. He often wore dark jeans, leather jackets, and bracelets on his hands, giving him the look of a guy who wasn't afraid to break the rules. Among the girls, he was something of a local celebrity. Julia's classmates were always hanging around him, hoping to get his attention. Sarah saw how Liam stood out from the other boys and carried himself with a certain cool confidence. Julia admired him. It seemed to her that they had a special connection, perhaps not romantic, but something more than just a friendship. Liam, whom she perceived as her close friend and protector, was important to her. Julia often talked about him, shared moments together, and in her eyes, Sarah saw the belief that this connection was meaningful and would probably last a long time. Sarah tried to support her daughter and nodded in approval as she listened to Liam talk, but she couldn't help but notice that sometimes Julia spoke of him with a hint of disappointment. Sarah felt that there was some instability in their relationship that Julia could not understand or accept, but she was in no hurry to intervene. Maybe Liam was what she needed to understand herself and grow up, but everything changed the night they got to know each other. In her eyes, Liam became more than just Julia's boyfriend. Sarah thought over and over again about his penetrating gaze, his light touch, and his smile, which had something that defied description but evoked a sense of danger and forbidden desire. She knew that it was wrong, that it violated all the boundaries of her role as a mother and an older woman, but she could not help herself. Sarah felt trapped, unable to explain her feelings. She began to notice how often she thought about Liam, during normal everyday activities, while sitting at work or even cooking dinner. She found it difficult to concentrate, and noticed that her thoughts kept returning to him. This feeling was new, exciting, and frightening at the same time. The town where they lived suddenly seemed too small, cramped, and stuffy. Sarah was afraid that someone might notice this unusual tension between her and Liam. She was afraid of her own thoughts and feelings, and she was terrified of the possibility that it might reach her daughter. At the same time, she couldn't deny the fact that a spark of life had been rekindled in her heart, a fire she thought had long since died out. When Liam walked into their home one day to help Julia with a project for school, Sarah felt it almost physically. She had left them alone in the living room, trying to keep herself busy in the kitchen, but the sound of their laughter, the half-serious jokes, and the general light-hearted tone of Liam's conversation with Julia affected her more than she would like to admit. And although Sarah tried to ignore her feelings, she was sinking deeper and deeper into them, as if she were walking on the edge of a cliff, deliberately avoiding looking down, knowing that with every step The abyss was only getting deeper. It all started with a chance meeting on a street in the town. Sarah went out to buy a few small things for the house when she noticed a familiar figure on the other side of the street. It was Liam. He noticed her too, and that tense feeling that had no explanation ran through them again. Sarah stopped for a moment but didn't look away, and Liam, smiling slightly, raised his hand in greeting. "Sarah," he said as he came closer, his eyes shining with curiosity. "I thought you had the day off today." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Yeah, I thought I'd take a walk," she replied, trying to keep her tone calm, even though her insides were in chaos. "What are you doing here?" "I have some free time," he said. He said it almost casually, but there was more than just a friendly invitation in his eyes. Sarah thought for a second, realizing all the possible consequences of this meeting. She realized that every step, every moment next to him was pulling her deeper into the abyss of forbidden desire. But this time, her inner voice was silent. She didn't want to hold back. "Of course," she finally answered, and they headed for a small bar nearby. The bar was quiet, with dim lighting and old wooden furniture. Only a few patrons were sitting at tables, deep in conversation, so it was easy for them to find a cozy corner at the far end of the room. Their conversations were ordinary, about music, travel, the city, but there was a depth to each word that Sarah couldn't ignore. "Sometimes I feel like I'm a stranger here," Liam suddenly said, looking at her over the edge of his glass. "Everything in this city feels too predictable. I want something more." As Sarah listened intently, she realized that Liam was the embodiment of lost dreams and youth she had once had, but which had disappeared over the years. She, too, had once longed for more, craved new sensations and emotions, but life had thrown up only responsibilities, betrayals, and losses. "I understand you," she said softly. "Sometimes it seems like life is passing you by and you're left empty-handed." Liam paused for a second to consider her words. There was silence between them again, but it was filled, as if words were unnecessary. He lightly ran his finger along the edge of his glass and, without taking his eyes off Sarah, asked, "What would you like now? Not in general, but right now." This question caught her off guard, but Sarah was not afraid. She realized that despite all her inhibitions and fears, at that moment she wanted only one thing: him. Something that didn't belong to her, but was so attractive and unknown. "I wish this evening would never end," she admitted quietly, barely able to contain herself. Liam smiled. He was looking at her silently, but there was something in his eyes that almost knocked her out of her inner balance. Their hands accidentally touched, and Sarah felt a current run through her body. She didn't move her hands away, despite all her internal warnings. With each passing minute, she realized that this connection was her own forbidden fruit. She knew that she was crossing boundaries, that she was risking everything: her relationship with her daughter, her own reputation, her inner peace. But this moment with Liam seemed so real, so honest. She couldn't stop. She didn't care about the rules that society imposed on them. "You know it's crazy," she whispered, laughing a little nervously. "But that's what makes life interesting, right?" Liam replied, leaning slightly toward her. Sarah didn't remember exactly how it happened, but in a moment their lips met in a quiet, deep kiss that seemed to stop time. She forgot about everything, about inhibitions, about responsibility, about fear. At that moment it was just her and Liam, their forbidden passion and endless desire. When they broke away from each other, Sarah felt reality returning to her, with its echo of anxiety. They both realized that there was no turning back from this moment. Their secret could ruin her relationship with Julia, destroy her daughter's trust, and tarnish her reputation, but none of that seemed to matter. "Maybe we should stop," Sarah said, trying to regain her composure. Liam just nodded, but she could see that he wasn't going to give up. Their meetings were becoming an inevitable part of their lives, like an illegal drug that could not be stopped. They both knew they were approaching the limit, and perhaps they didn't even intend to stop, despite all the consequences. They left the bar, and in the darkness of the evening streets, Sarah felt young and free. She returned to her normal life with a sense of danger and passion that burned her from the inside out. With each meeting with Liam, She lost control and gave in to her emotions, knowing that one day it would all explode. After all, you couldn't keep secrets like that in a small town. Her relationship with Liam was gaining momentum. The tension that had grown between them since their first meeting was now almost beyond what they could control. Sarah knew that every time they met, there was a risk that any minute could destroy everything. They started meeting in remote places in the town to keep the secret. Usually it was an old country motel on the outskirts of town where few people knew them. From time to time, Sarah and Liam would spend their evenings in a small bar or just walk in the shadows of quiet streets, hiding from prying eyes. And although they carefully hid their tracks, there were still little things: a glass with a lipstick print, an accidentally forgotten room key, or a hairpin that Liam carelessly left behind. Sarah noticed that Liam sometimes acted recklessly. He would easily forget to be careful, allowing himself to joke or talk about their encounters in his usual, overly frank manner. She tried to stop him, reminding him of the danger, but his levity almost shattered her peace of mind. One day, after another meeting, when Sarah started to pack her things, Liam leaned back on the bed with a glass of wine in his hand and smiled as if he knew something she didn't. "You know, we don't have to hide," he said defiantly. Sarah looked at him in surprise, trying to figure out if he was serious. "We can't live like this, Liam," she said calmly, but inside she was terrified. If anyone finds out, if Julia finds out. Liam shrugged and took a sip of wine. "She's a smart girl." He sounded indifferent, as if he didn't even care about the consequences. Sarah, on the other hand, was frightened by this attitude. She was still a mother, and Julia was still the most important person in her life. But every time Liam asked her to meet him, she forgot about her fears and succumbed to his power. Sarah saw Liam becoming more and more careless and reckless. Sometimes he was rude, making careless jokes that hurt Sarah. She was beginning to suspect that he didn't care that her life could be ruined by this connection. But when they were alone, she didn't have the strength to resist. Liam won her over with every encounter, and although his frivolity and rudeness sometimes disturbed her, Sarah ignored these signals. She surrendered to the moment, to his every touch, losing control. They discussed the past, laughed, and sometimes fought, but each evening ended passionately, as if it were the last, and each time they left behind tiny traces that could someday become evidence. She knew that one day this could end in something terrible. Her heart ached at the thought of what Julia might find out, but the desire she felt for Liam seemed to overshadow everything else. It was like a drug she couldn't give up. One day, when she returned home, Sarah suddenly noticed that her motel room keys were missing from her bag. Her heart leapt. If someone found that key, it would ruin everything. She quickly returned to the motel, where no one was supposed to know her and Liam, and found it lying on the bedside table. She was filled with cold fear, but she picked up the key, trying to remember if she had left any other traces. Little things like this worried her more and more often, but her desire to be with him overcame all her fears. Their secret was becoming more and more difficult to keep. Sarah lived as if on a knife's edge, but every time they met, she became addicted. There was no peace in her mind anymore, only a relentless urge that she could no longer control. She realized that one day it would all end, that her secret life was just a temporary escape from reality. But the moment she saw Liam, when they touched each other, all fears and doubts disappeared. Only desire remained in her heart. She lost herself in this secret connection, in her own mistakes, which were becoming more and more obvious to anyone who could see their traces. The last weeks brought Sarah a feeling of bitter fatigue. With each new encounter with Liam, it became more and more difficult to hide their relationship, and her life became a series of deceptions and secrets. She could no longer find peace either at home or at work. Every new meeting, every brief kiss, every casual touch only fueled her obsession. She felt that she wanted Liam completely, without a trace, wanted him in her life openly, without the need to be secretive, but it was impossible. Sarah realized that any truth would destroy not only her life, but also Julia's. However, the desire consumed her more and more, forcing her to approach the point of no return every day. Every time Sarah looked at Julia, she felt pain. Her daughter was the only real close person in her life, and now, because of her weakness, This bond was on the verge of collapse. Julia looked anxious and more withdrawn than usual. Sarah noticed that her daughter sometimes looked at her with suspicion or even inexplicable anxiety. One evening, as they were eating dinner together, Julia suddenly asked, "Mom, you look tired lately. Is everything okay? Maybe you need to get some rest?" Sarah tried to smile, but she felt like it was a bit of a stretch. "I'm fine, honey. It's just work and, these little household things," she replied, avoiding direct eye contact. But Julia continued to stare, and Sarah felt that her daughter could see through her, could see her secret. "Are you sure? You look a little different," Julia added quietly. Sarah felt her heart clench with anxiety and despair. She knew Julia was beginning to suspect something. Perhaps it was just a woman's intuition, perhaps she had noticed some small things, like her frequent late returns or her excitement after meeting Liam. Sarah realized that it was becoming increasingly difficult for her to hide her condition. Meanwhile, Liam became even more unpredictable. He started avoiding her calls, showing up at meetings looking distant. He was visibly nervous, as if something was bothering him. Sarah noticed him becoming rude from time to time, even cold, when she started talking about their future. "Why do you keep checking up on me?" he replied sharply during one of their meetings. Sarah felt a sharp pain at his words, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. She tried to find out what was bothering him, hoping that it would help keep them connected. "Liam, I'm just worried about us. I want to know what's going to happen between us," she replied quietly, trying not to show any hurt. "What's going to happen?" He laughed bitterly. "Sarah, you know we can't tell anyone. You're more afraid of your daughter than you are of us. Let's just accept that this is just for now. That's all." His words were like a blow to her heart. She didn't want to believe that this was just a temporary adventure for him, but his indifferent gaze and half-hearted smile only made her pain worse. Sarah felt like she was losing control of both the situation and her feelings. This obsession was becoming unbearable. That night, when she was returning home, the thought of Julia's confession came to her mind. She imagined telling her daughter the whole truth, telling her about her feelings, about the despair and pain that tormented her. Sarah believed that she could find understanding from her daughter, that perhaps Julia would accept her weakness and understand. But every time she gathered the strength to have this conversation, she was overcome with fear. She imagined how this connection, having destroyed her life, would turn against her and leave her alone. She was afraid that the confession would destroy the fragile trust she still had with her daughter. Finally, one night, when Julia started asking her uncomfortable questions again, Sarah almost blurted it out. "Mom, I think you're hiding something from me," Julia said, looking her in the eye. "Julia, she began, but couldn't continue. The words were stuck in her throat. Her daughter looked confused and perhaps even a little scared as she realized something was really happening. Sarah felt a wave of shame wash over her. She realized that she couldn't confess to Julia, at least not now. Her fear of losing her daughter outweighed her desire to share the truth. Sarah gathered her strength and said, "I'm sorry, honey. You're just worried about me, and I appreciate that. But I'm fine, honestly. I've just been having a hard time lately." Julia nodded, but her eyes betrayed a deep sadness. She didn't say anything, and silently got up and went to her room, leaving Sarah with a feeling of emptiness. When Julia disappeared behind the door, Sarah realized that she could not take it anymore. She was on the edge, and no matter what she decided to do next, this relationship with Liam was turning into a destructive force that was consuming her life. That evening, Sarah and Liam had another fight. What had started out as a reconciliation soon turned into a loud argument that left no room for silence in Sarah's home. Liam was irritable and unstable, his face becoming more and more alienated and his voice more and more rude. Sarah felt on the verge of collapse. She was strangled by anger and frustration, by the pain of his indifference. "I gave you everything I could," she screamed, her voice breaking into a desperate whisper. "I lost myself for this connection, for you, Liam, and this is all you can give me? Indifference and rudeness?" "You knew what you were getting into, Sarah," he replied, barely able to contain his anger. These words knocked the ground out from under her. She looked at him as if he were a stranger, not recognizing him as the guy she had lost her head with. A wave of anger and despair, mixed with bitterness, swept over her. She realized that for him it was just an adventure, but for her it was a destructive addiction that had destroyed her life. "You have no right to do this to me," Sarah exclaimed, her voice trembling. Liam took a sharp step toward her, his face distorted with rage. "What are you going to do, Sarah? Are you going to tell your daughter? Tell everyone you're having an affair with your daughter's boyfriend? Do you really think anyone will support you?" His words stabbed her like a knife. Sarah felt a cold, deep, and unbearable emptiness fill her. But at that moment, something changed in Liam. His eyes were filled with a dark, dangerous rage. She realized that he was no longer in control. "Liam, please," she whispered, stepping back a step, but it was too late. A shot rang out. Sarah felt something hot and unbearable pierce her body. She staggered back, her eyes filled with tears and pain. She tried to take a step, but her legs wouldn't listen. Everything around her became blurry, and her strength was leaving her. She fell to the floor, feeling the life leaving her body. The world was slowly sinking into darkness, but through her blurred vision, she managed to see Liam standing over her, his face puzzled and his eyes filled with terror. He suddenly turned, glanced around the room, as if assessing what he had left behind. His hands were shaking, and his eyes were tense and frightened. Without wasting a second, he rushed to the door and ran out of the house, leaving Sarah on the floor, dying and alone. Soon Julia returned home. She noticed an unusual silence that seemed disturbing, and her heart sank with a premonition of disaster. She opened the door to her mother's room and froze when she saw her mother lying on the floor, surrounded by a pool of blood. A broken glass and wine stains were visible on the floor, and a cigarette butt was lying by the window. Julia froze for a moment, feeling her mind refusing to accept what was happening. Her mother was lying motionless, her eyes closed, her face calm and yet pained. The girl rushed to her, grabbing her hand, but Sarah was no longer breathing. Julia screamed in pain and despair, her scream cutting through the silence of the house. At that moment, she noticed a shadow outside the window, a male figure disappearing into the darkness. Trembling, she moved closer and saw the shadow move away, quickly dissolving into the night. Julia sobbed, realizing that this person had been here, in this house, that it was she who had taken her mother's life. She sank to the floor next to Sarah, gripped by unbearable pain. Her hands trembled. She tried to find a pulse once again, hoping for a miracle, but she knew it was impossible. Sarah was no longer breathing. Julia looked around, her eyes filled with tears, but she noticed details that she might not have noticed otherwise. The broken strap of the bracelet her mother always wore, the red wine stain on the floor, the cigarette butt by the window that belonged to someone else, not her mother. These details, while insignificant, ignited questions in her mind that she could not yet answer. She sat on the floor next to her dead mother, feeling her own world falling apart. Detective Jonathan Blake arrived at Sarah Lynch's house before dawn. He was an experienced detective with dozens of investigations under his belt, but this case, even at first glance at the scene, seemed complicated. Small details at the crime scene immediately caught his attention. His experience told him that there was a hidden story to be unraveled, and the key to it was not in the obvious things, but in the inconspicuous traces. The room where Sarah's body was found looked both ordinary and unusual for a crime scene. He saw spilled red wine on the floor, the remains of a broken glass. The glass was lying nearby, and Blake noticed fingerprints on the glass. The strap of the bracelet that remained near Sarah's body was torn, as if it had been ripped from her hand by force. He noted this detail for himself. Perhaps Sarah was trying to hold someone's hand to stop them. Near the window, the detective found a cigarette butt mark, which clearly indicated the presence of another person. He quickly concluded that the killer might have tried to escape through the window. A neat but subtle shoe print was left on the windowsill, another clue that suggested how things had developed. Blake carefully recorded all these details, and his intuition was growing stronger and stronger that Sarah's death was not just a random murder. He listened carefully to Julia's testimony, who spoke of the shadow of a man running away from the house, but still looked confused and deeply upset. Blake sensed her anxiety, but decided not to press the girl. He knew that she was still in a lot of pain, and over time, she could remember important details that would help to clear the case. Liam was called in on suspicion, and Blake immediately noticed his behavior. Liam seemed calm, even too relaxed for someone who had probably had an affair with the victim and now learned of her death. He answered questions abruptly and sometimes with a touch of disdain, as if annoyed at having to spend time on details he thought were irrelevant. "Where were you that night, Liam?" Blake asked calmly, watching his reaction. "I was at home," Liam replied with a shrug. "Asleep, like any normal person." "Do you have any witnesses who can confirm that?" Liam hesitated for a moment, and Blake could see a shadow of nervousness on his face. "No, I live alone. No one can confirm that." Blake nodded and continued to ask questions. Liam answered without a hint of empathy, and this alarmed the detective even more. He knew from experience that lies can be detected not so much through words as through inappropriate emotions. His suspicions were heightened when he hinted at a possible connection between Sarah and Liam, but Liam categorically denied any intimacy with the woman. "Sarah was just an acquaintance of my friend. I had no special relationship with her," he said dryly, staring at the table in front of him. But it was obvious to the detective that this was a lie. He saw Liam's fists clench for a moment, and that made him even more certain of his suspicions. It was becoming clear that Liam was hiding something very important, and Blake decided to carefully check every piece of evidence he had collected. Later, he returned to the crime scene with a team of experts. They carefully examined the fingerprints left on the glass and on the empty bottle of wine that was on the table near Sarah's body. The shoe prints near the window were also recorded, and Blake ordered them to be analyzed, hoping that this could provide accurate confirmation of belonging to Liam. Experts examined the broken strap of the bracelet. Fingerprints were taken from it, and Blake realized that this could be a key piece of evidence. It looks like Sarah was trying to stop someone, possibly Liam, but he ripped the bracelet off her hand when he hit her or tried to escape. Detectives were waiting for the forensic results with growing impatience. They knew that this data would be key to exposing Liam's lies, or, conversely, to confirming his alibi. Blake no longer doubted that this relationship, these small details, the shoe prints, the prints on the glass, the broken bracelet, all of it was important and would lead them to the truth. When the forensic results came back, Blake realized that he was on the verge of solving the case. The results of the examination confirmed Detective Blake's suspicions. The fingerprints on the wine glass and the broken bracelet were Liam's, and the shoe prints near the window matched the size and shape of his boots. These were not just suspicions, they were direct evidence that Liam had been present in Sarah's home that fateful night. Blake gathered all the materials and went to Liam for another conversation, this time more severe and unrelenting. Liam would not be able to respond to this evidence with simple excuses. When the detective entered the interrogation room, Liam sat with a defiant expression on his face, as if he was confident that he could avoid the charges. But this time, Blake felt that under the pressure of the facts, the truth would come out. "Liam," the detective began, sitting down across from him, "we have evidence that proves you were at Sarah's house that night." Liam frowned, but tried to remain calm. "I told you I don't know anything. Nothing happened with Sarah, and I wasn't at her house." Blake pulled out the crime scene photos and spread them out in front of Liam. One of them showed a glass with fingerprints on it, the other a broken bracelet and a cigarette butt mark by the window. "Your prints were found on the glass that Sarah drank from. There are also prints on her bracelet, which was ripped from her hand during the struggle," Blake said, keeping his eyes on Liam. "And the shoe print on the windowsill matches your boots, too. You were there, Liam, and we both know it." For the first time, Liam looked confused. His gaze wavered, and the cocky mask fell from his face, leaving only fear. He took a deep breath, as if weighing each word. "Okay," he finally whispered, giving up. "Yes, I was there, but I didn't mean to kill her. It was an accident. She attacked me, screaming that she was going to tell Julia." "What happened next?" Blake asked coldly. "She lost control. She said she wanted to tell her daughter that we were together. I was afraid it would ruin me. I tried to stop her, but she continued. She started grabbing my arms. I pulled away, and then the bracelet broke. Liam swallowed nervously. She said she couldn't keep quiet anymore. And I just couldn't let her. Blake listened in silence, noticing how Liam was getting more and more lost in his own confession. "And that's when you decided to take the gun and shoot?" the detective asked with icy calm. Liam fell silent, as if he were cornered. He realized that he could no longer deny the obvious. "It was an impulse. I didn't mean to." His voice trembled and his eyes were desperate. "I didn't want to, but I didn't see any other way out. She would have ruined everything. I couldn't let that happen." Blake stared at him in silence, feeling justice finally being served. Liam had destroyed Sarah's life and left Julia grieving and alone, and now he was trying to justify himself with his own fears and selfishness. "Liam," Blake said after a pause, "your desire to avoid problems cannot justify taking a man's life. You have ruined not only your life, but the lives of many others." Liam lowered his head, his shoulders slumped and hunched. He realized that his story was over. Detective Jonathan Blake felt the bitterness of victory. He had solved the case, but he knew that no amount of success in the investigation could bring Sarah back to life, or lessen the pain of Julia, who had lost her mother to a man she could not trust. Liam's trial became a central event for the entire town. The murder of Sarah Lynch shocked the community, and people were eager to find out what drove the young man to commit this horrific crime. It was hard to imagine that a young man whom Julia considered her friend and her mother a close person could be capable of such a thing. The courtroom was crowded. Julia sat on the bench among the spectators, surrounded by friends and family. She looked broken, but determined at the same time. Her eyes were on Liam, who was sitting in the dock with his head down. After all the testimonies and speeches of the parties were completed, the judge proceeded to pass the sentence. It was obvious that Liam committed the crime not only out of fear, but also out of selfishness and unwillingness to take responsibility for his actions. The judge emphasized that no person has the right to take the life of another because of their weaknesses or fears. Liam was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. His sentence was a reflection not only of his crime, but also of the destruction of lives that it caused. The sentence was a fragile consolation for Julia, but she knew it would never bring her mother back. After the verdict was announced, Julia left the courtroom with a sense of bereavement, but also relief. Her life had changed forever, but she had gotten justice for her mother. She felt that perhaps she could one day find the strength to move on with her life. As Detective Blake watched her leave, he realized that sometimes even the most accurate evidence and the fairest verdicts cannot heal the wounds of the heart. But he hoped that truth and justice would give Julia at least a small hope to move on with her life, remembering her mother, but not letting this loss destroy her own life.